with a few minutes on what we had done till now, and then we'll move to a new aspect of unsupervised learning, which is dimensionality reduction. What we have seen till now, that initially we learned about descriptive data science, where given a data, we were analyzing that data, what is the nature of the data, what is the underlying structure of the data, and that we were measuring based on the central tendency and dispersion measures. We calculated different types of statistics for that. And then we were able to get some idea about what has happened in the past. Then we moved to the next phase of data science, which is making predictions or the predictive data science. And here we intensively use the concepts of machine learning. So we train the machines to learn about different patterns based on the past data and also make the predictions for the future. In that context, we learn the techniques of regression and classification. But in these two cases, as you have seen, the pattern was that we were given some data, and that data contained the features and also the labels. That is the actual outcome from the past observation was given there. And based on that, in the different exercises that we had done, we were able to predict the price of a house using the regression technique. We were able to classify the handwritten digits into uh, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we saw that in both these cases, what the machine learning algorithms or the machine learning models were doing is trying to find out a function which will create a map between the features, that is the x that we have, and the labels or the y. So creating a map of a function or mapping from x to y, that is what the algorithm was doing in the backend. And how it was doing? It was doing based on the gradient descent that we had learned earlier. That is, it assigns some random value, then it sees that what would be the output. Then we compare the actual value with the prediction that we have made. If there is a difference, then the application comes back and refines those numbers and see that how uh, trying out with a different weight would be giving us a better result. So we had also talked about a simile as to how do we find the place where our loss or where the difference between the prediction and the actual is minimized. And then we had said that finding a minima of the loss is like the process that is followed is like you are blindfolded in a valley and you are left somewhere randomly, and then we say that now you are blindfolded but still you have to reach to the bottom of the valley. Then what you do is that you take a step to the left or take a step to the right and see that if the step to the left is taking you upwards and that you can feel, and then you will move your step to the right, and if to the right you see that the slope is going down, then you will start moving towards right because you are moving down the hill, and then you hope that you will find the valley that way, and then you will reach a spot where either you move left or you move the right. You are not really descending and you start ascending. In that case, that is the bottom. That is what our algorithms also do. But now we are entering into another kind of algorithm, which is called the unsupervised learning. When we say supervision, it means that the data earlier was supervised somehow. It means that when we were doing the classification and we were asking the system to identify that whether the handwritten digit is 0 or 1 or 2, somebody had spent time and manually said or manually marked there that this particular image is actually the image of digit 5. this particular image is the image of digit 8, and that data was given to us. So y was given to us. Y is the supervision process. So based on the supervision process, that value of y was given to us. Now we are talking about a data where the that y value is not there, and with that, what all can we do? So here we had talked about earlier that we can do clustering. It means that based on the underlying patterns inside the data, we can identify the structure, we can identify the pattern, and then we can say that these are the homogeneous groups in the data set. And that experiment we did with the mall data set, where we said that based on the different characteristics of the mall visitors, like the age, the gender, income, or the spending pattern, we saw that there are four homogeneous groups inside that entire data set. And we can use these four homogeneous groups for the marketing purposes. We can have a different type of marketing campaign for all of these because they are different in characteristics. So that's what we did in clustering. Then we also did a very interesting exercise that on the iris data set, we first, because there we have the y value also available, or the classification of these iris flowers has been done manually, and that classification is available to us. We would, based on that data, we had trained our model using a classification, because there the manually made classification in the form of y was available. Then we saw that using one of the techniques, we were getting about 86% of accuracy. Then we removed the labels, that is the manually given code, and then we created cluster. It means that without being aware of any kind of manually done classification, we just had the data about the sepal length and petal length, sepal width and petal width of the iris flowers. We did the clustering, and then we came to a conclusion that there are three different types of flowers there. And then when we matched our classification with the uh, our ID, or our cluster ID, that we had done without knowing about the actual classification, and then we matched with the actual classification, and we saw that there is a very high degree of matching there. So it means that we can actually do a lot of things even without knowing about, or without having a prior information about what kind of things are there in my database. We would be able to, we can do a lot of things. For example, we will be able to identify that there are three different types of flowers. I may not know the names because we don't come from the botany background, but just because we have certain tools in machine learning in our hand, if I see that data, we would be able to say that there are three types of flowers. And if somebody helps me that, okay, these three groups we can name as, say, A, B, C, then we can actually compare that if somebody had done that kind of classification, and we see that the match is very high. And I also gave the example that not only just in the flowers, but um, great scientific achievements like the periodic table. It was um, derived based on the human experience, the human intelligence, and that with several years of study and research, the periodic table was designed. But in the other labs in some of the universities, what they have done, the experimentation is that can all this data about different elements or different types of atoms, it can be fed into the system without telling that how many different types of elements are there, but just you feed the data into the system, and then the entire periodic table we have been able to derive based on the machine learning algorithms. So periodic tables means obviously the system would not be able to say that uh, this particular element is hydrogen or this particular element is nitrogen, but it will say that yes, there are 110 or 115 different types of elements in the world, and then the naming can be done. So that is what we can achieve by clustering. And we also talked about that why clustering is so important today, because majority of the data that we collect, there would be no labels available. And the volume of data which is getting collected today based on our internet usage or based on the sensor data that is getting collected from the IoT devices, it's just not possible that for somebody to really sit and do the labeling. And in that context, the unsupervised learning becomes very important. We saw the process of doing the clustering based on the k-means algorithm. What we do is that we find out the distance between the center and the different points. And for calculating the distance, we use the Euclidean distance method. So we all, on all the different attributes or the parameters that we have, we find out the distance between the two objects, and then we say that which one is closer to that what, and then based on the proximity of the different observations, different elements in the data set, we define that whether it should belong to cluster A or cluster B. And then we also saw that the measurement of the good clustering, we used two measures. One was the inertia and the second was the silhouette score. We computed both, and then we saw that how using these two measures, we can come to a conclusion that whether we should divide our data into two clusters or three clusters or four clusters that we have seen yesterday. Today, we'll talk about another kind of clustering, which is called the hierarchical clustering. So here the method that we use is very different. As you can see that the hierarchical clustering, one of the examples we see is in biology. That is, every living being is connected to the other somehow or the other. So for example, at the broad level, we define all the living beings into plants and animals. Then we say that, okay, so that's the first division that we have, or first cluster we make, is that all the living beings are either plants or animals. So we divide all the living beings into two different clusters. Then when it comes to animals, then we divide them into vertebrate animals and the invertebrate. It means that those who are having a spinal cord and those who don't. Then even within those animals which are having the spinal cords, then we have different types of animals, like belonging to the bovine family, or uh, primates. Bovine means like say cows or buffaloes. So cows or buffaloes are different, but still they are much more similar to each other compared to say chimpanzee and human beings. So chimpanzee and human beings, they belong to the primate uh, branch of the animals, and the cattle and the buffaloes, they belong to the bovine branch of the animals, and so on and so forth. We can go on creating the divisions until we reach to the last group where the further division is not possible. So that's an example of hierarchy. That is what is being shown here, that using different parameters, we can create different clusters. And the same principle we can apply in biology, the same principle we can apply in chemistry. So depending upon different parameters, different types of elements can be grouped into either a gas or a liquid or whatever. So this is the principle. And again, we need to see that how the system itself can create this kind of hierarchy, and what is the logic being used in the end. As throughout we have seen that the coding part is actually very simple. It just requires 3 or 4 lines of codes, and then it is able to give the result. But as data scientists, we should be knowing that what is happening in the backend, not in very great mathematical detail, but you should be able to have a good grasp of, you should be able to explain to your customer, your boss, or to somebody else that this is how the mechanism is working. This is why I am using regression and not classification. Even within the classification, this is why I have chosen to work with random forest model as compared to the SGD classifier or decision tree classifier. So these are the type of things that you should be knowing and you should be able to explain. And that is the reason that we'll also try to understand what is hierarchical clustering and how it is actually being done. So what is hierarchical clustering that we have seen here? That you have been given a group of data. So based on some parameter, you will divide that into first two groups. Then those two groups, based on certain parameters, you can divide into two or three or four different groups. And the same process you keep on doing, and you reach to a stage where further division is not possible. So either we can do it top down or we can do bottoms up. Means that you identify the individual elements first and then see that which two elements are having greater similarity or greater affinity between the two, and then you start grouping them into groups, and then you start going up. So hierarchical clustering or the creation of the hierarchy can be created either top down or bottoms up, and we present this in a type of diagram which is called a dendrogram. So for example, this kind of tree structure or uh, this kind of hierarchy we create, and a graph would be created which is called a dendrogram. Okay, so if you see, uh, we have all these numbers. We can visually classify them as to which numbers are nearer to the other ones, and then either it can be represented like this or it can be represented like this. So if we are represented like in the tree structure here, that is called the dendrogram. And that is what we will create as an output on the given data. So if you compare the hierarchical clustering with the k-means clustering that we had done, the differences you see that in the k-means clustering, we had to give the number of clusters that we want the data to be divided into upfront. So we had to give the numbers that create three clusters or four clusters or five clusters, and then using the performance measures like inertia and silhouette score, then we said that out of the different numbers of clusters we have created, it is most appropriate to have three clusters in the case of iris database or four clusters in the case of mol database. The good part is that in the hierarchical clustering, you don't really have to start with an assumption that so many clusters should be created and then you measure the score. We just feed the data into the hierarchical clustering model and it will create the dendrogram. And then we can simply find out that what is the best suited number of clusters, and that information we can derive just visually. So one of the big benefits of the second method is that we don't have to make any assumption about the number of clusters that the data set should be divided into. And as we have seen with the classification in the case of the plants or animals, some of these things actually give us a very meaningful categories, what is also called as the taxonomy or the meaningful categorization of the uh, data elements, like in biology or in chemistry, we can achieve that. As I talked about, that either we can start from the top and go on dividing the entire data set into different clusters, or we can start from the bottom and we can go on aggregating them, and that's called the agglomerative clustering. So today we will experiment with the agglomerative clustering. Here also, it will work based on certain distance matrix, that is one element or one group, how close or how distant they are from each other. The principle remains the same, because once we are doing the clustering, actually we are saying that cluster means the elements which are close to each other. So the basic principle or the basic notion of clustering remains the same between k-means clustering and the hierarchical clustering, but the method is different. The way that we compute the distance measures, that would be different. So in the case of k-means, we have seen that we can compute the difference. We compute the difference measure based on uh, Euclidean distance. Here, as you will see that here also different methodology can be used for calculating the distance, and that's how the hierarchies can be created. But on the downside, you will see that hierarchical clustering is actually difficult to work with if you have a very large data set. So for a small and medium data set, it works very well. But for the large data set, it's actually very time consuming, and it does not provide you much of a benefit that the k-means can actually give you. So how do we do the agglomerative clustering, which is the most popular technique of doing the clustering as we come to the hierarchical clustering? So the basic algorithm remains very much similar to what we have seen in the k-means, that we compute the distance matrix between the input data points. So different observations that we have, will compute how far or how close they are to each other. And then the data points which are close to each other, we put them into one cluster, and data points which are farther from each other, we put into a different cluster. And here agglomerative means that we are starting from the bottom. So we have different elements. We will compute the distance matrix, and those which are closer, we will start merging them. Okay. And so suppose I have 5 different elements, and we will see, so two closest ones, we'll merge them into one group. Then I am left with 4. Then again, we will see that which two are the closest. Then we will again merge them. So that's how the hierarchical clustering would happen. So we go on creating more number of groups, starting with the total number of data points that we have in the data set. And the same process we go on doing until we are left with a single cluster. So let's see how it happens. If we have, say, these different data points, now we will compute the distance of each element with the all the other elements, and then we'll identify the 2 data points which are closest. Okay, so we see that here, in after doing the first level of operation, we can group them into cluster 1, cluster 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Actually, this process will happen one by one. So first we'll do, maybe these two appear to be the closest, so it will first create a cluster here. Then we will go and see that these two are the closest. Then it will create second cluster. So that's how we'll create, say, uh, after a few steps, we see that these are the 5 clusters. Then as we go into the next step, then the same process repeats, because these clusters are now have now become the elements for me. So we'll see that maybe C2 and C5 are closer to each other compared to the others. And therefore, in the next iteration, these two will be grouped, and that will become another cluster. So this process will continue until we reach only one cluster. So after we see that C2 and C5 are closer, we merge them into a single cluster. And this process will continue. So then we again come back to that, how do we define the distance between the two sets of points, or 2 points, or 2 clusters? And that will be based, I mean, we have different types of options available. And based on that, there would be variations between the models. So the most widely used is what we call as the single link distance. So we take each element of the two groups, and then we compute we find out the two most similar objects, and then we go and group them. How do we find that? So we say that if X and Y belong to two different clusters, C1 and C2, then we find the distance between the two, or and then wherever we find that this distance is minimum, that is what we create into a single cluster. So that's called the single link distance. It means that we are just measuring the difference on different attributes of the elements in cluster 1, elements in cluster 2, very similar to or the same as what we are doing in the um, k-means as well. And that's how we go on uh, defining the difference. I mean, the dendrogram will be created based on the same logic. So we have two different kinds of representation. Normally, we use the dendrogram, but we can also create the what is called as the nested cluster. It means that since these are the clusters within the cluster, you can also represent them in a different way. But most widely, the dendrogram would be used because it's also easy for us to identify with the dendrogram as to how many clusters we should actually have, and we'll go into that sometime later. So, apart from the single link clustering, we can also go for other models like the complete link uh, clustering, and that will give you some different type of uh, dendrogram or the nested cluster tree. So as we said that not necessarily you don't need to really go into that much of a detail of the actual computing mechanism, but it's sufficient to know that there are different methods available for doing the hierarchical clustering, and the methods differ on how do we compute the difference between the two. So all the formulas and all are available, but I don't want to spend too much time on those things. For example, we can also go for the group average distance. So we can take the distance between all of them, then we average out. So three different ways we have seen: the single link, the complete link, and the average link. One of the things that we need to notice here is that when we are using one algorithm or the other, we need to see that what is the computational load that each algorithm creates in the system. So, for example, if my database is increasing from say 10 to 100 or 100 to 1000, is my computation load on the system, is it growing linearly? That is, if I have 10 records, then using algorithm 1 will take, so if I have say 100 records, that will take 10 times more than if I have another data set which is having only 10 records. So that's the linear progression in the computational load. But in some cases, you will find that the computational load is not increasing linearly but exponentially. And that exponent could be uh, either a square or a cube. So here we are seeing that in the hierarchical clustering, as your database size grows, your computation time actually grows by a power of 3. It means that if we are taking, say, 1 minute to process a data set, which is having 100 records, it will the time taken for the 1000 records will actually not be 3 minutes. It will grow exponentially. So if you have taken 2 minutes, it will take 8 minutes, and not just 4 minutes. So it goes on increasing exponentially, And that's why as your database becomes larger and larger, the hierarchical clustering will actually take tremendous amount of more time. So in some of the cases, we need to be aware as to what is the load that the system creates. And that's why we said that hierarchical clustering is not very suitable for a very large data set, because the computation time is actually growing by power of 3 with the increase in the numbers. So that was hierarchical clustering. Let's see if we can proceed with that. We'll, okay, so it is already connected. So we start with importing the different libraries which we would use. Small data set we have seen several times. Today I'll just repeat one process on the iris data set. Where is iris data set? Yeah, so we'll import the iris data set. This one also has the label name or target name, which is given here: Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. These are the three varieties of the iris flowers. And we had seen what is what are the different data elements which has been given to us. So if you see the features which is available to us, it is the sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. So sepal and petals are the two main components of the flower, and we have been given the length and width of each of them. And based on that, we can do the classification and say that the flower belongs to either a Setosa subspecies, or a versicolor variety, or a virginica. So in the data set that we have, these three things have been given, and we had run the classification earlier. So let me first go through the classification exercise here, what results we have got, and then we'll come and do the clustering. It means that without even knowing the target, what is that we can achieve, and then we'll compare the two. So here also we are importing the data. Now since we are doing the classification, we are putting the features into X and labels into Y. And we are seeing that there are three different varieties: 0, 1, and 2. These are the labels which have been already created by human inspection or human supervision. Since we are doing the classification, we split our data into train and test, and we get 4 different files: X train, X test, Y train, and Y test. With that, we import the classification model. We create an instance of that, and then with the fit function, we train the model. And while training the model, we pass the X train and Y train as parameters. This part we have gone through now several times, and therefore you would see that these are only 4 or 5 lines of code which is required for either doing the classification or for regression, and even in the case of clustering, the process is not very different. So for actual machine learning algorithm, for running the actual machine learning algorithm, what you need to know is just about these limited syntax: how to import, how to create an instance, how to train, and how to get the predictions. So in these 3 lines, we have imported the model, we have created the instance of the model, then we have trained the model, and now we will see the results of the model. So we asked now the model to make the prediction on the test data, and here it is throwing these numbers. These are my predictions, and when we compare these predictions with the actual numbers, then we get the accuracy score, and we see that our accuracy score is 89%, or out of 100 flowers data which will be given to us, I will be able to make the right classification 90% of the times with this model. And of course, if we use another model, my accuracy score can even go higher. Okay. So this was the classification. Now, the benefit in this classification is that you also had the data of Y-train. It means that when we are training the model, it can go and check what the actual number was, what the actual classification was, and then it can go on refining the model. The difference in the clustering would be that I don't have the access to this Y-train. So during the training process, I don't have the luxury to go and check with the actual data and see that whether my classification is correct or not, appropriate or not. So that luxury I'll not have when I start using the clustering mechanism. Still, we will see that without having the benefit of going and checking with the actual results that whether I am right or wrong, we can still do a very good job with the clustering. So when we're doing the classification, and during that process, we had the benefit of going and checking with the actual result. We achieved 89% accuracy. Okay. Now we just come to clustering here. Here also I have the iris data set, but if you see, I am not using the Y. We will run the clustering only with X. It means that the information about the labels is not available to the system. So we run the clustering. So we get the data and we see that this information is available. This file does not have the labels. And then we come to the clustering. We'll do the clustering with the function that we had created. Okay. So now we call this clustering mechanism, but we are only providing the information about the labels. Okay. So if you see in the, when we train the model here, you see model.fit, we are only providing the data, and that data is X iris. So it means that labels information is not available. So we'll run this one. Okay. Then after doing the different types of analysis, we came to the conclusion here by using the ELVO principle. We saw that this iris data set is most appropriate to create three different clusters, because 3 is the place where the elbow formation is the most obvious. Just to remind you, how do we create this elbow formation and how do we decide upon how to choose the number of clusters? We compute the inertia score by running this model 10 times. So we first start with creating 2 clusters. Then in the for loop, it will create 3 clusters, 4 clusters, up to whatever number we want to give. So we have created different number of clusters. And for each cluster, we are fetching the performance measures. And these, so first we train the model here. So first we train the model with 2 clusters. Then we get the inertia score, we get the silhouette score, and we are going on storing that into 2 different lists. And those are the lists we are getting here once we run the model. Then we can see the values that if we, this one is showing that when I created 2 clusters, the inertia was 152. When I created 3 clusters, inertia was 78, and so on. Similarly, we get the silhouette score values here, that when we created 2 clusters, my silhouette score value is 0.68, and so on. Also, just to refer again, what were these inertia and the silhouette score? The difference was that inertia is only taking the distance between the center of the cluster and all the other elements which belong to that cluster. So we take the Euclidean distance between the center and all the other observations. That is forming, or that is the inertia score. So the average of that would be the inertia score. And we also talked about that as we create more and more clusters, the distance between each cluster starts becoming smaller and smaller, and therefore the distance between the center of the cluster and the elements of the cluster, that starts becoming smaller. So you will always see that in the when we take the inertia as the measure, the inertia score keeps falling with the increase in the number of clusters, which is bound to happen because as we create more clusters, each cluster becomes smaller, and therefore the distance between the center and the objects, that also becomes smaller. In the Silhouette score, we take not just the distance between the center and the elements of a specific cluster, but we bring in another element and say that let's also measure the distance between the observations belonging to one cluster with the observations belonging to the other cluster, which is the nearest cluster. And we say that the distance between the elements of one cluster to the elements of another cluster, we call that as distance b, and the distance which is there among the observations of the same cluster, we call that a. So obviously b should be larger than a because b is measuring the distance between the elements of one cluster with the elements of another cluster. And Silhouette score that way brings in another dimension to the uh, cohesiveness of the cluster and says that don't just measure the distance among the observations belonging to the same cluster, but let's also see the distance between the elements of the same cluster and the distance of these elements with another cluster. So that way the formula becomes b minus a divided by the max of a and b. So Silhouette score gives you that number. So these are the two different measures that we will use. So Silhouette score does not really follow always this pattern of a decline in the score with the cluster. It can either increase or it can decrease. And then what we do is that we are now plotting the the inertia score, and we look for an elbow. When we say that we look for an elbow, it means that before that point, the fall in the inertia score is actually very fast, and after that, it will continue to fall, but not with the same rate. So we see here that there are two potential candidates for elbow. One is at three clusters, and one is at the four clusters. But at the three clusters, it's more pronounced. So maybe our first choice would be that let's divide this iris data set into three different clusters. And similar exercise we can do with Silhouette. So you can see here that Silhouette score is actually falling with the number of clusters, but that would not be the case always. Then we also plot the Silhouette score, and we went into that by doing the Silhouette plot. How do you really identify that whether there should be three clusters or four clusters? This plot is a very interesting plot. It gives you three things we had said we need to see. One is the symmetry between the size of these clusters. So here, when we are dividing it into two clusters and draw the Silhouette plot, we are seeing that symmetry is not really good because one cluster is almost double the size of the other cluster. The second thing that we had to look into the Silhouette plot was whether it is crossing this vertical line. So the ends of these clusters, are they really crossing that? In this case, it is crossing that. So that criteria is met. The third one was that are there certain misclassification? And misclassification means it will start, some of the elements will start going into the negative direction. So here the 0 is there and there is nothing in the negative territory. So it means if we are creating two clusters, it is meeting two criteria, but not the third one. If we come to the three clusters, or if we choose that the ideal number of clusters to have on this data set is 3, then it's meeting all the criteria. Although symmetry is not as what we would like to have, but still it is more symmetrical. When we go into the 4 clusters, we see that symmetry is actually lost. The Second from the bottom is actually very large compared to the third from the bottom. Just give me 1 second. So based on the analysis of the inertia score and using the elbow method, and based on the analysis of the silhouette plot, we come to the conclusion that it's most appropriate to divide this data set of iris data into 3 different categories. Sorry. So now we are doing the clustering. Now we are dividing this into, we'll run the model again with the 3 clusters, and we have got the data. And now what I have also done is that bring the classification that we had in the supervised learning. So I'm also now adding the, not just our own clustering, which we have given the names here. So I am storing in my cluster level the data which I got out of the clustering process. And in that process, I did not have any information available about the labeling which was done by the experts. So I have created these clusters blindfolded without having any information about what these flowers could be. I have just seen the similarity between these flowers and said that there are 3 different categories. And then we said that how do we name the categories? Then we also bring in the actual labels which was done by the, say, botany experts, and we would like to see that side by side, that whether these are matching or not. So if we do that, if we see this data set, which is having the original data, and then these are the labels which we arrived at based on our clustering exercise, and this is the labels which was given by the experts. Okay, so when we arrived the clusters, it was only named 0, 1, 2, and then we have given the names to these clusters after consulting the experts, suppose. Now, if you see that there is a lot of match, we can also find out that out of 150 records that we have, how many are matching and how many are not matching. So in this one, we are saying that show me the count of those records where the value in the cluster, this is what we created based on the clustering exercise, is not equal to the label which was given by the experts. And we see that out of 150, there are only 16 records or 16 observations where when we did the clustering blindfolded, that is actually equal to, or that is the same. So only 16 cases it is not matching. Remaining 134 cases out of 150 cases, we have been able to identify that this is a different flower compared to the other correctly in 90% of the times. So that also shows you that with the clustering, we can actually do a reasonably good job of identifying the homogeneous groups. So the example I was giving is that it's like if only machine learning experts are walking into the forest and there are 3 different types of flowers, we would be able to identify that there are 3 different types of flowers. We may not know the names of the flower. But if you're also walking with a friend which is expert in botany, then he may be able to point out that this one is rose and this one is marigold and this one is hibiscus. But even without that, using machine learning or using our own observation, we are able to identify that there are 3 different types of flowers. That is what the clustering mechanism does. And the output of that is actually very close to what we are achieving based on the human supervision or based on the expert supervision. This example I was giving to give you the confidence that even if I don't have the labels available, even if there is no supervision in creating those labels, even though we do not have the luxury of going and checking that whether my uh, result of my prediction or result of my classification is the same as the expert's opinion or not. That is, I don't have the luxury to go back and check with the actual labels created by the experts. We can still do a very good job with clustering mechanism. And K means clustering is what we have seen till now. So now we will try to create clusters based on agglomerative clustering. And as I told you that the coding part of that is going to be very simple. So here the process also remains the same. I call another model from the library. So from sklearn.cluster library, we import agglomerative clustering. We create an instance of that, and then we train that model calling the fit function. And this this fit function will be provided only. So here we want to run with X iris, so we'll put the X iris data, and we have no labels. Okay. So if we run that, and the labels of that we store into cluster. Now for the plotting the dendrogram, we need to call a function from the SciPy library, because the dendrogram functionality, I think, is not available in the matplotlib. So I will draw that with the help of some SciPy library. Okay, so this one will be X iris. So first I run that with the mol dataset, which was given the name of X. So I think now I should draw. So you see now it has drawn the dendrogram of the iris dataset. This is how the dendrogram would look like, and you had seen that earlier in the PPT. Now seeing this dendrogram, now we have to take a call that what should be the right number of clusters or right number of groupings that we have in this data set. So after we draw the dendrogram, the logic that we use in finding out that how many groups it should be is that we draw, say, a horizontal line. Okay, so visually, just imagine that we are drawing a horizontal line. Okay, so we can see here that from here we can draw a horizontal line here. We can draw a horizontal line here. We can draw a horizontal line maybe here. We can draw a line, say, here. Okay. And the trick is that after having drawn these horizontal lines, then we have to see that which of these gives you a clean cut, the most clean cut division, and not just the most clean cut division, but the most largest number of clusters in the most clean cut division. So here we have a clean cut division, and we get only 2 clusters if we are taking this line. So there is a possibility that yes, we should go with 2 clusters, but then we come down here and we still see that there is a clean cut division, and we get 3 clusters here. So we will prefer this line to this line, because even though my division is very clean, it is still giving me a higher number of clusters. When we come to the third one, here, okay, when we come to the fourth line, it is giving me 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 different categories, and that is also actually looking like a clean division. So based on the agglomerative clustering, we could go with either 3 or 5. But as you go below that, it gets very muddled because lot many things are there, and the division is not really visually very clean. So if you go with this agglomerative clustering, and after having drawn the dendrogram, our conclusion would be that either 3 or 5 are actually the good numbers to have. Okay. So in the clustering, since we are not having any label, this kind of confusion will always be there, that whether we should go for 3 or whether we should go for 4 or 5. But we have 3 different techniques to use. So if we combine the 3, the indications are that in the iris flower data, we should actually be going with possibly 3 is the best way, because whether we use the inertia as the measure and the elbow method, the best elbow formation was coming at 3. The silhouette score, the best, the visually when we see the silhouette plot, the best number of clusters was coming to 3. Even as we draw a dendrogram, 3 is a good number, although 5 is also actually giving me a good indication. So if we combine the 3, then we see that maybe dividing this data, or dividing this data set into 3 different categories, is the best way. So in the clustering, you have seen how do we do the k-means clustering. You have seen that the results of the clustering is very close to what we actually get if we had the supervised data available. So it gives us the confidence that it's a good way to actually do the groupings of the data that we have. And we also saw that how we can do the agglomerative clustering, and how to analyze how many numbers of clusters we should have based on the agglomerative clustering. We also saw that how the agglomerative clustering happens. So in this case, it will actually start from the bottom. So it takes all these elements, all the 150 records that we have is all available here at the bottom. So if you count these, maybe it will come to 150, or maybe it is showing from one level above. I'm not very sure. Looks like that all the 150 is getting plotted here because the numbers are given here. So it will first plot all the 150, then it will compute the distance between all the elements. Whichever two are the closest, then it is creating the first cluster, and then it will see that which two clusters are the closest, and then it goes on grouping them into uh, a higher level cluster, and that's how the hierarchy grows. So having drawn the dendrogram, how do we arrive at the conclusion that how many different types of clusters we should actually have, is by drawing a horizontal line, or by visualizing a horizontal line and seeing that at which point of time I am getting the largest number of clean clusters, not really getting into the muddled zone or the very congested zone, but I have a very clear depiction or clear cut segregation when I draw a horizontal line. So just let me remove these horizontal lines, and then we'll proceed. Okay. So we have done k-means clustering, and we have done the agglomerative clustering. As I mentioned, that code is actually very simple, just the 3 lines of code, and you're able to fetch the model, instantiate the model, train the model. Then we get the results of the model, and for the plotting dendrogram, we call a function from the SciPy library. Now let's repeat the same process on the mol data set, and then I would like you to apply your mind and saying that, okay, in the mol data set, how do we analyze? So we had done the exercise with the mol data set earlier. So I'll draw the dendrogram also with the mol data set. So I have imported the mol data set. We'll put into X. So here we are doing some pre-processing because there was gender as a non-numeric data field. Okay. So now if we see X, okay, so we have got, we'll convert this X into a data frame. Now we are ready to run the clustering. So the K means clustering and the formation of the silhouette plot that we had seen earlier. So here we can run this with X. So we can run the clustering program again with X. And here we see, earlier we had seen that 4 is actually appearing to be the most appropriate number of clusters. So now we will create the agglomerative clustering. We'll do the agglomerative clustering with the mall data, and we'll see that how the dendrogram of the mall data set looks like. So here we will run with X. X contains the mall data set. So if you see here, we have got this kind of dendrogram for the mall data set. Again, we will use the same process. We'll draw the horizontal line and see that which gives the most clean cut. And so here we get 2 clean clusters. But as we come down, let's see if we are able to get clean cut of more number of clusters. So we get in the dendrogram also, if we draw a horizontal line here, we have 4 different clusters and I get a very clean division there. If I draw, say, maybe here, we get not that clean, but still we can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different clusters. But below 5, actually it becomes very congested and we do not get a very clean division. So the dendrogram tells you that either 4 or 5, these are the right number of clusters to have. As we draw anything below that, it becomes overlapping and not very clean. So by seeing the silhouette plot and by seeing the dendrogram on the mall data set, now we see that 4 appears to be the most appropriate number of groupings to be have. And that's how, after doing all this analysis, now you would go back to your customer and say that the data that you have given to us about the mall visitors, the most appropriate number of clusters that we should create, or the most appropriate number of the homogeneous buyers group we should create is 4. And then if you want, you can have a different types of marketing campaign, a different kind of discounting schemes for all these clusters. That is what we can achieve through clustering. If there are, so I hope you have understood why we do clustering. Clustering would be required, or it would be almost become a mandate for you if you don't have the label data available. That's one of the very important ways to analyze the data if you don't have the labels. But still, we want to see the patterns in the data set. So why clustering is required? Then we saw that how do we do the clustering? The process is, there are 2 main ways of doing the clustering, k-means and hierarchical. In the hierarchical, it can be done in 2 ways, agglomerative or divisive. Normally, we'll use the agglomerative clustering. Then after the clusters are created, we need to move to the next step as to how do we analyze these clusters and how do we arrive at the conclusion that how many clusters we should create out of the data set that we have. And then we say that we'll use two different measures if we are doing the clustering through k-means, and that is inertia and the silhouette score. Inertia analysis, how is that done? So we compute the inertia score for different numbers of clusters, and then we draw a line chart, and we look for an elbow formation in the line chart. Wherever the elbow formation is the most pronounced, that is what the ideal number of clusters should be as per the inertia analysis. The second analysis is that we draw the silhouette plot based on the silhouette score, and then we look for three things in the silhouette plot: whether the clusters are symmetrical, whether the clusters are crossing the horizontal line, and whether there are certain elements which are getting misclassified. It means that whether they are going into the negative territory. So these are the three things we see, and whichever number of cluster gives us the best score, or no, best visual representation on these three counts, we say that that is the ideal number of cluster. Then we draw a dendrogram. The analysis of the dendrogram is also very simple. After the dendrogram is drawn, then we try to split that through a horizontal line, and that will tell me that at each, when we draw the horizontal line will cross the dendrogram at multiple places, and that is the number of clusters that we would have. So at this point of time, it is telling me that we will have two clusters. Then we come here, it tells me that you will have four clusters. So we look for a place which gives me the highest number of clusters, but where the division is very clean. So all these are visual representation after the clustering has been done. In all three cases, it's visually that you try to see that what should be the best number of clusters. And if there is a agreement between all the three schemes that we use, or all the three methods that we use, in that case, that becomes the most ideal number of clusters. So I suppose the clustering as a mechanism is clear to all of you. If there are any questions, then we'll take on clustering. Otherwise, we move to another use of or another methodology in the unsupervised learning space. So if you can confirm that it is okay and there are no further questions on clustering, we'll move to dimensionality reduction, which is another very important use of unsupervised learning. So I'll wait for confirmation from at least one of you, and then we'll move to. Fine. So I'm assuming that clustering part is fine. Now we move to the another very important use of unsupervised learning, and that is what we call as the dimensionality reduction. When we get the data set, the last two data sets that we have used, like the iris flower set or the mall data set, we had only some 4 or 5 different dimensions to analyze. But if you compare the data sets that we had used earlier, like housing data set, that was having about 10 different features or 10 different dimensions. So each feature is actually a dimension. So number of dimensions was large there, but if you recall the number of dimensions that we had in our digits data set, that was 784, because we were treating each of the pixel as one dimension. And as you go into many of the real life scenarios, like doing the analysis of the weather in meteorology, you may have the dimensions running into thousands of them. If you come to analysis of, say, human genome or many of the medical data, then you may have the dimensions running into tens of thousands, because if we are analyzing the human genome, there are more than 20,000 genes in humans. And similarly, there would be more than 20,000, or some animals have even more than that. So if we are going into different types of analysis, you will find that the number of dimensions actually become very large. And what we mean by dimension here is that once you have the number of dimensions very large, the analysis actually becomes more time consuming, analysis becomes more difficult, and therefore we need to have some techniques which will reduce these number of dimensions without actually losing the underlying data. So we now we understand that why do we need an dimensionality reduction techniques and how it really helps. So when we had drawn this images in our previous examples, it was this was supposed the image of 6, but underlying, if you see, this was the data structure. We had 784 different dimensions of this particular image, and then we were analyzing these 784 dimensions to uh, analyze that whether this particular digit would be 1 or 2 or 4. But what is relevant for us here is that we had 784 different dimensions. Now, if we go to, say, I was talking about the human genome and human proteins, if you see, based on, say, analysis of the proteins which our blood is carrying or we have in different parts of the body, if we extract the different types of proteins, we also will be having hundreds of varieties of protein in the human body. But suppose if you want to find out that based on the analysis of the protein, I would like to categorize them into a sick person or a healthy person, a patient or a healthy person, we can do that. I mean, in the tables we can do that. But suppose I have, say, more than 100 different types of protein, we cannot visualize because we can plot only two dimensions. We can plot only maximum two different proteins uh, on the chart. Maximum we can go into a three-dimensional depiction, but not beyond that, because more than three dimensions we can't really draw, we can't really plot. And seeing things visually actually makes a big amount of difference. So for example, if we say that these black ones are the uh, healthy people and the red ones are the not so healthy people, if we have that kind of visual depiction available based on the different types of proteins that we have, it will be very good for us. It will be very good for the doctors to see this and say that possibly you should go for further check, because the system is showing that based on your protein analysis, there must be something wrong. And therefore, you should go for further investigation. Now it's very, so if we have data about the two proteins or three proteins, it would have been easy to do the depiction earlier. But it's not always possible because I have hundreds of different proteins. So even though we would like to depict the people in this kind of diagram, the fact is that the protein number of proteins or the protein reactivities, they are go into hundreds. So if you see, the actual data is something like this. So we have hundreds of proteins, and these are the values of, say, suppose the protein reactivity, and then with based on the combination of these values, we can say that this is patient. But obviously, I can't plot all these 100 because that will become 100-dimensional plot. And if we have, say, this kind of pattern, we'll say healthy, but then we have to rely on analysis of this data into some tables, and not that's visually very difficult. So one reason that we will go for dimensionality reduction is visualization, that we want to visualize the data into two-dimensional or a three-dimensional plot, and therefore we need to reduce these dimensions into lesser number of dimensions. So if I have say 100 of uh, protein dimensions, 100 of different types of proteins in the body, can we really reduce it down to two or three so that I don't lose the data. At the same time, I am able to project that into a two-dimensional or three-dimensional space. So that's one of the reasons that we do dimensionality reduction. The other very important reason is that if we have 1,000 dimensions or 10,000 dimensions, that does not really mean that each of these attributes is giving me some additional information. We have taken an example from the housing database. We have seen that there was data available about total bedrooms and there was data available about total rooms. Now, uh, and the correlation between the two was very high, about 93 to 94%. What the high correlation actually meant was that the one of them is not really giving me any additional information. So if I know about the total bedrooms in the house, I also know that how many rooms that house would normally have. So even if I don't have the information about the total number of bedrooms, and if I have the information available just about total number of rooms, I am not really losing any information because I would be able to possibly derive the other from uh, the information which is available about the total bedrooms. So that's the same principle here, that just because I have the information available about variety of uh, attributes, that does not really mean that I need all of them for my further analysis. And that's also the reason that we say that let's reduce the dimensionality so that the analysis becomes faster, the computation time would becomes lesser, and possibly it will be even more effective. So these are the two main reasons why in machine learning or in the predictive data science, we want to have certain techniques which will reduce the number of dimensions that we have, the number of attributes that we have, because um, it makes the computation easier. Also, you can link this to the earlier discussion that we were having, that in some cases, as your data size grows, the computation time taken by the algorithms or by the machines does not grow linearly. It will grow exponentially. It means that whatever time I will take if I have say 10 dimensions versus 100 dimensions, then the time taken will not be 10 times, it will be the square of that. And that is the reason that also we need to look for dimensionality reduction. But we have to do the dimensionality reduction in a fashion that we don't really lose the data. And that's where certain techniques are used, which will ensure that dimensionality reduction is achieved. And at the same time, we don't really lose a lot of information. And there are statistical measures to find out that how much information has been lost if we reduce the dimension. We'll go into that one by one. So let's see what we mean by dimension. So if I have data about different individuals and if I have data about only one protein in the body, or we can take the example of the housing here, that these are the different houses that we had in our housing data set. And suppose I have the information only about the number of bedrooms. So it's a one-dimensional data. I have the information about different people, but only on one dimension, only on one the value of one protein. So that's one-dimensional data. And this can be plotted like this. So I need to have just only one axis and I can plot all these on that axis. This is how we'll plot if I have only one-dimensional data. And if you have one-dimensional data, the plot can be either a uniform distribution of that data or it can be a non-uniform distribution. But still all the data points we're able to plot on a single axis. Now, if we have data about, say, a second protein, or if we try to link this to our housing data set, I have the information about the total number of rooms in the house and total income of the people who are living in that house. So that becomes the second dimension. So once we have two dimensions available, we can plot that on a two-dimensional graph. So suppose here we have the information about two different proteins. So if this was the plot of the single protein value, and if we get the data about the second protein, this is how it will be plotted. So we will have not just the x value, but the x and y value. We will have two different coordinates available, x and y. And therefore, this point will actually move here. So now the person A would not be depicted at this point of time, at this place, because I also have the information available on the second dimension, which is here. So the point A actually moves here. So we'll plot the person A not at this point, but in this point in a two-dimensional space. All of these is the basic, mathematics that you would have done in the high school, and but still I am repeating this here so that the concepts become a bit more clear. So if I have information about even this information about the second protein for the person B, then that person will move from say here to here. That is how the plot would be done. And that's how the plot of each of these would change. So earlier I had the information about only first protein and all the people were plotted on the horizontal line. Now I have the information about the second protein, and therefore the plot has actually moved. Now that I have two different proteins, we still see that if it is plotted like this, or if the data is like this, it looks like still there is a good correlation between protein 1 and protein 2, because you can draw all of them are more or less closer, and there could be an underlying line around which the data is there. But there could be a possibility that these are plotted like this, and therefore visually also we see that there is hardly any correlation between protein 1 and protein 2. There is a possibility that we have the information about the third dimension or the third protein available, and in that case the plot would be done something like this. 3D diagrams can still be done. May not be that easy to understand as the two-dimensional diagram, but still it can be plotted. But obviously we can't go beyond three dimension. So if I have only one-dimensional data, it can be plotted like this. If I have two-dimensional data, we can plot it like this. And if you have three-dimensional data, possibly we can plot like this. But beyond that, plotting of the data will not be possible because we can't really draw a four-dimensional. So what would you do if you have, say, 200 dimensions? The issue is very clear that I will not be able to plot it. And the second thing that we had discussed is that 200 dimensions means more computing power. Nowadays, computing power is not really a big problem. So we are trying to explain these things more for the purpose of understanding the data set. Don't get into the mindset that 200 dimensions is actually very large for the machine learning algorithms to process. Not at all. We will be in machine learning algorithms, you will receive a lot of data sets which will be having 1,000 dimensions, 10,000 dimensions. Still, given the computing power that we have available, processing of those things should not be a problem. The problem arises if the algorithm, like the agglomerative clustering algorithm, where the computing time taken is actually increasing exponentially. In those cases, the larger the data set you have, you will require actually exponentially large amount of time or exponentially large computing power. So that's these are the places where you would actually like to use the dimensionality reduction. And if you're a small data set, total size of the data set is actually small, then you don't really need to worry about dimensionality reduction from the computing perspective. But from the visualization perspective, definitely you will require, because visualization can't handle anything beyond three dimensions. So if you have 200 dimension, we ask the same question again, that all these dimensions are equally important, or can I eliminate some of them? And if I eliminate some of them, is there a scientific method? Is there a mathematical way that we can say that This is how the dimensionality reduction would be done so that I don't lose much of the information which we have. So let's see. We draw the protein data with one dimension and then we drew the protein data with two dimension. But suppose the two-dimensional data that we had comes out like this. So our first dimension was uh, on this line, and then I got the data about the second dimension and it becomes this line. So if you see here, it is actually lying on the same dimension. That is the information that we have got or the variation that we are having in different people or the readings of the protein data of different people. The variation is actually happening from left to right. It means that variation is limited to protein 1. The variation in the values of the protein 2 is hardly there. And therefore, protein 2 is not really adding much of a value to the information which I already had. So I had the information about protein 1. And if I want to distinguish the people based on the protein readings, that whether they are healthy or whether they are sick, the information about protein 2 here, assuming that this is the kind of plot we get, we see that protein 2 is not really helping me distinguish that whether the person would be sick or he would be healthy, because the readings on protein 2 is more or less the same. So we say that this, in that case, if we just preserve the data of protein 1, we are not losing much. This is one of the conceptual way to understand that now I had the information about protein 2, but even if I discard that information altogether, I'm not losing much because there was hardly any variation on the second dimension, on the protein 2 dimension. And therefore, if I live with this plot and remove the second dimension, we can safely proceed. We know that not much information is lost because the important variation is from left to right. Now let's see this plot, which we had got the actual values of the protein 1 and protein 2. Here it's not a straight line, but if you see, it is still lying along a straight line. So if I make this as the axis, earlier my horizontal x-axis was the line along which all the variation was lying, and therefore that was the most important dimension for me. So if I draw a line like this, we see that most of the variation, and the variation is actually giving me the data to distinguish person A from person B. So here you see that the variation or the actual information is lying along this axis. So if I make this as an axis, then I don't need another dimension. So, and there is very little variation on this dimension. So now if I rotate this dimension, just mentally you visualize that now we say that all my information was lying along if all my information was lying along this diagonal dimension, so I'll take this diagonal dimension as a single dimension on which I have the information available. And in that case, I can afford to discard this dimension and I can afford to discard this dimension. So by combining the protein 1 and protein 2 data, I can create a third dimension. So I had information about available about protein 1 dimension. I had information available about protein 2 dimension. Now I combine the two and create a third dimension because all this information is actually available to me along the third dimension. That is what we can achieve with the dimensionality reduction. So I discard the other two dimension and I create a third dimension, but it is still a single dimension, and single dimension is actually very easy to plot. So I can not just have, um, I have been able to reduce two dimensions into one dimension. Similarly, I can reduce maybe 200 dimensions into two or three different dimensions, and then I will not have lost much of the information. That is what dimensionality reduction is all about. So we can have a second dimension, we can have a third dimension, but obviously if we have a number larger than that, we can contain our information into two dimensions. So I had a series of data about the proteins in the human body. Now we're using some technique. What these techniques are, we'll go into that in future, in the future classes. But now the information that we had on hundreds of proteins, I have been able to reduce that into two dimensions, and then I'm doing a plot, and that plot is able to tell me that who are the people who are sick and who are the people who are healthy. Okay. So eventually, what it will do, so you can see that dimensionality is for each dimension you will have a coordinate on the chart. So if you reduce that into two dimension, I can draw a two-dimensional chart. If I have information about three dimensions, we can do a three-dimensional chart. So we'll stop here. Tomorrow we will do this with the help of the code, and we'll see that how different techniques of dimensionality reduction we can do with the help of the different libraries of machine learning. So if there are no questions, then we'll end the session here, and then we'll again resume tomorrow. Okay. So we'll stop here and see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.